Hi, students. Today I'm going to be giving you the second video lecture from Chapter 1, where I'll be covering the 3 domains of living things. This corresponds with Section 1.2 in your text, and I have here on the slide the guided notes questions that you should be able to answer while listening to this lecture and also looking at page 8 and 9 in your textbook. There's also a video animation that the textbook made that I have posted on Blackboard in this module as well. So all of those things to do are your responsibility. And it's always like a good thing to read through these questions ahead of time so you kind of can keep an ear out for what's important, although I'd like to think everything's important. Okay, so here we go. So when we think about biology and living things, biologists believe that life originated all from one common ancestor. And so what does that mean? That means that billions of years ago, if we think about what we just learned in the previous video lecture, living things are organized. So billions of years ago, atoms combined to make these molecules that make up living things like proteins, carbohydrates, lipids. We're going to talk about those later in this module. And then those molecules joined, what's the next level? To make cell, which is the unit of life, right? And then those cells were the first form of life. And so that's the common ancestor that we all have. So here I have the theory of evolution explains the diversity and unity of life. The theory of evolution suggests that all living things came from a common ancestor, that first cell. But then that first cell started to evolve over time. And some cells that originated from that common ancestor started to change. And those differences helped those cells, allowed them to conquer new areas on Earth. And that's where the modifications arose. So common descent with modifications. Everything we see on Earth today, if we go back billions of years, arose from one common ancestor, and then that ancestor, right, reproduced, and those offspring over time started to acquire modifications that helped them in new environments. So that's what we mean by descent with modification. And those modifications, right, are able to occur because of evolution. And we're not going to get a lot into that in this unit, but that's the idea. So now we're going to talk about that common ancestor, and from that, today, we classify life in 3 domains. And we're going to talk about how those domains are related, what characteristics they have. So here is, sometimes we call it an evolutionary tree or a phylogenetic tree. And this tree is showing you on the left that common ancestor, the first cell. So if you think about this tree, as you move to the right, it's kind of like time, right? So the ancestor, the common cell, this was way back when life originated. And then as time went on, as we move to the right, so follow that blue line, those cells that were all pretty similar started to acquire modifications. And they acquired modifications, and those cells, right, are descendants of what we now know, one that split as the domain bacteria and the domain archaea. So we're going to talk about these 2 domains for a little bit. So these 2 domains share a few things in common. These domains consist of living things that are both unicellular, meaning only one cell, right? So bacteria you've probably heard of before. Certain bacterial strains can get you sick. Others are beneficial, but they're all single-celled. Archaea you may not have heard of before. So archaea are also single-celled organisms, but they're not as common in environments that we are in. So archaea are often found in these extreme environments. So for example, they're found in swamps where there's no oxygen, in the mud where there's zero oxygen and most life cannot live. But they have acquired modifications that allow them to live in these areas. You also find archaea on the bottom of the ocean where there's no sunlight and none of those producers that can absorb sun and convert it to energy, so they can use other chemicals, right? We also find them in extremely salty environments where nothing else can live. But they're single-celled, and just like bacteria, their type of cell is a prokaryotic cell. So prokaryotic cells are different than the cells that we are made out of. Those don't have a membrane-bound nucleus that contains the DNA. The DNA is just kind of in the region of the cell. Bacteria, the domain bacteria, are also unicellular. They're also prokaryotic, but they're found everywhere that we habitat as well. So they're found on our skin. We have bacteria all over our skin. We have them in our intestine. They're in the ground. Okay, so they're found in most areas, and they're not found in those extreme areas, but they're way more common. All right, they're also prokaryotic cells, meaning they don't have a membrane-bound nucleus. From there, we've talked about the domain bacteria and archaea. Let's move down. So if you look at this tree, the way you see it is that we had the common ancestor. Those cells started to get modifications to some became what we know today as bacteria, some what we know today as archaea. Scientists think that from the ancestors of the archaea branched a third group that we now know as the domain eukarya. So we're not going to get into this a lot, but if you look at these trees, you can see that the eukarya and archaea have a more recent common ancestor than the eukarya and the bacteria, because the common ancestor is the branch point, right? So if you see that, let me grab, there we go. If you can see my pointer. So here we are with the eukarya. If you go backwards, here's the branch point of the eukarya and archaea, which is more recent than if you go all the way back to find the branch point with the bacteria. So scientists think that the domain eukarya and archaea are more closely related. The difference with the domain eukarya is that it has organisms that are multicellular and the type of cell changed, right? So here you see cell with nucleus. So that was a modification that happened in the past to some cells that allowed them a benefit, right? Allowed them to somehow have an advantage. That's why it continues. And so the cells of organisms in the domain eukarya have what we call eukaryotic cells. So eukaryotic cells are like the cells we have, right? They have a membrane-bound nucleus. So here is just some written down information that I just said. The domain archaea, right, contains unicellular prokaryotes that live in extreme environments, right? Prokaryotes lack membrane-bound nucleus. Domain bacteria contain unicellular prokaryotes that live in environments including our skin, our mouth, large intestines. And I will add that, don't forget, bacteria kind of have a bad connotation because everyone uses antibacterial soaps, but there are many benefits that we as humans get from the bacteria that live on us, in us. The domain eukarya contains unicellular and multicellular organisms, so both. And the main difference here is that they are made up of cells that are eukaryotic cells, which contain a membrane-bound nucleus. All right, so we've talked about the three domains. Now what we're doing is focusing on the domain eukarya, so here, And then the domain splits into smaller groups called kingdoms. Okay, so there are 4 kingdoms in the domain Eukarya. So and we're going to look at examples of this first kingdom, which are the protists, in one of our last labs of this semester. Of the semester. So protists, right? Protists contained many single-celled organisms, but don't let that confuse you, make you think they're part of bacteria or archaea. So what is the difference? They're single-celled, but they contain eukaryotic cells. Many of these protists live in the water in aquatic environments. Many are what we called autotrophs, which means they can use the sunlight and convert that to organic matter. So like photoautotrophs, they use light to make their own organic matter. We're going to look at some of those later in the semester. The other 3 kingdoms are plants. Plants are autotrophs, meaning they can use the light to convert it into organic matter. They don't have to eat organic matter. Plants are multicellular, and they live on land. So how would that differ from protists? Well, protists live in water. They can be multicellular or single-celled organisms, and they can use sunlight to produce organic matter. Fungi, right? You can see their little picture. It might look familiar with mushrooms, right? Fungi, sometimes people just assume they're kind of like plants, but the reason they're not is because they can't use sunlight, right? They can't use sunlight to convert it into their organic matter, their food. They actually have to consume organic matter just like we do. They're often in the group decomposers, but they're multicellular, also eukaryotic, because all of these kingdoms are in the domain Eukarya. They are all made out of eukaryotic cells. And the last one are animals, which are not producers, right? We're consumers. We're multicellular. And we're going to talk more about animals later in the semester as well. All right, and then this is just another little addition that we're looking at time. So again, the point of this is that life originated from the common ancestor, and then that common ancestor, right, had all the characteristics of life. It was organized. It could reproduce, right? It could maintain homeostasis, which means a different internal environment than an external environment. It could respond to its environment. It could reproduce. It could develop. And then from those common ancestors, right, they started to modify. Why? Because if they're all exactly the same, they're all going to be competing for the same resources. But if they have variation among them, and those variations maybe will help them, for example, in the archaea, live in areas where there's no oxygen, well, they're going to keep those modifications. And the bacteria, well, they have other modifications that let them live in areas with oxygen well. And so because of those modifications, the group started to split. And then more modifications arose. From the ancestors of the archaea, the membrane-bound nucleus arose within the cell. And from those ancestors, we started to split even further into what we now know as these 4 kingdoms. So again, that's why in biology we talk about descent with modification. We're all related because we have a common ancestor, but then modifications have arisen over time. And that's really what we refer to as adaptations, right? We talked about living things have adaptations. They allow them to survive in their environment. Okay, that's it for now.